What started as an 8-day expedition has turned to a rescue mission.
NASA's announced this morning 2 American astronauts will have to wait another 6 months to come home after being left stranded on the International Space Station.
The world has shown images of 2 astronauts, alive and safe aboard the International Space Station, but from the ground. A whisper from the very man building their escape route paints a darker reality. Elon Musk declares, "The Boeing Starliner's astronauts are not with us anymore." A chilling sentence passed on 2 souls we can still see with our own eyes. Is this merely the taunt of arrival? Or a coded message announcing the death of something far greater? A legacy just buried among the stars? 2 heirs and a dying legacy. To understand the story of the stranded astronauts, we must travel back in time, to a moment when America's power in space seemed to be fading away. For many years, the United States had a magnificent fleet of reusable space planes known as the space shuttles, which were the country's proud chariots to the stars, carrying astronauts to and from the giant laboratory floating in the sky, the International Space Station. But in the year 2011, the Space Shuttle program came to an end. And with its retirement, America suddenly found itself without a vehicle of its own to transport its people into orbit. This created a very serious and embarrassing problem, because the country was forced to rely on its old rival, Russia, paying millions of dollars for a single seat on the Russian Soyuz rockets just to keep a presence on the space station it had helped to build. To solve this problem, the American Space Agency, known as NASA, created a bold new plan called the Commercial Crew Program. The idea was simple. Instead of the government building its own spaceship, NASA would pay private American companies to build new space taxis that could safely and reliably carry astronauts to the International Space Station. A great competition began, and 2 very different companies were chosen to receive the grand prize. The first company was Boeing, a true giant of the aviation world, a legendary corporation that had built airplanes for over a century and had been a trusted partner of NASA since the very beginning of the space race. Everyone believed Boeing was the obvious, natural choice to win. So they were given a massive contract worth $4.2 billion to develop their spacecraft, the Starliner. The second company chosen was a much newer and less proven player called SpaceX, led by the famous entrepreneur Elon Musk. Seen as an underdog and a risk-taker, SpaceX received a smaller contract, worth only $2.6 billion, to build its own capsule, the Crew Dragon. With all of this money and all of this trust, it seemed like an easy victory was guaranteed for the giant company. A simple task to build a safe ship. But what nobody knew at the time was that the first signs of a terrible, hidden sickness were about to appear. A sickness that would threaten the entire mission and everyone involved. The first symptom, a failed diagnosis in 2019. With all the money and trust from NASA, Boeing was finally ready to show the world its brand new Starliner spacecraft in December of 2019. This first mission was called an uncrewed test flight, which means there were no people inside the capsule, only a test dummy named Rosie and some cargo. The simple plan was for the Starliner to launch into space, fly itself to the International Space Station, carefully connect with it in a process called docking, and then safely return to Earth. This flight was meant to prove that the spacecraft was a reliable and safe vehicle for future astronauts. A perfect taxi to the stars as promised. The rocket launch was beautiful and powerful, and for the first few minutes, everything looked absolutely perfect as the Starliner separated from its rocket and began to float in the silent darkness of space. But soon after, something went terribly wrong deep inside the spacecraft's computer system. The problem was a critical failure in something called the Mission Elapsed Timer. You can think of this timer as the spacecraft's internal clock. And this special clock is extremely important because it tells the ship exactly what to do and at what exact moment it is supposed to do it. For some reason, The Starliner's clock was set to the wrong time, so the entire spacecraft became confused about where it was and what it was supposed to be doing. It began to fire its small steering engines, which are called thrusters, at the wrong moments, trying to perform maneuvers that were not scheduled yet. This mistake caused the Starliner to burn through a huge amount of its precious fuel. And without that fuel, it was now impossible for the ship to complete its journey and reach the International Space Station. The mission was a failure, and NASA and Boeing saw this as a software error, a fixable mistake in the computer programming. But this was not just a simple glitch. It was the first clear and dangerous symptom of a much bigger sickness, a warning sign that was not understood correctly. The sickness spreads, a battle against continuous failures. After the major failure of the first test flight, NASA was very concerned and ordered a complete investigation into everything that happened with the Starliner. This was not a quick check. It was a very deep and serious review that lasted for many months. And at the end of it, the investigators gave Boeing a long list of 80 different things that had to be fixed before the spacecraft would ever be allowed to fly again. While Boeing's engineers were busy working on these 80 fixes, which mostly involved the computer software, they began to prepare the same Starliner vehicle for another attempt at an uncrewed flight to the space station. But as they were getting ready for this second launch in the year 2021, the engineers discovered a completely new and very alarming problem. A problem that had nothing to do with computers. They found that more than a dozen critical parts inside the spacecraft's engine system, called propulsion valves, were stuck. These valves are like very important taps that open and close to let fuel flow to the small steering engines. And if they are stuck shut, the spacecraft cannot steer itself correctly in space, which is extremely dangerous. The reason they were stuck was because they were corroded, meaning they had been damaged by a chemical reaction, similar to how metal rusts. This discovery was a huge setback, because it showed that the Starliner's problems were not just in its software brain, but also in its physical body. The launch was delayed again, and it took Boeing almost another full year of extensive work, taking parts out, cleaning them, and testing them over and over to fix this new valve issue. Finally, in May of 2022, the Starliner launched for its second uncrewed test flight. And this time, it seemed like all the hard work had paid off. The spacecraft flew perfectly. It successfully docked with the International Space Station, and it returned home safely. Everyone at NASA and Boeing felt a great sense of relief. They believed the sickness had been cured, and the Starliner was finally ready to carry people, the expert pilots, and the unreliable machine. With the success of the second uncrewed flight, NASA finally felt confident enough to take the next enormous step, which was to officially announce the two very experienced astronauts who would be the first humans to fly aboard the Boeing Starliner. The two people chosen for this incredibly important and risky mission were Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams. These were not ordinary passengers. They were highly trained test pilots. And a test pilot is a special kind of pilot whose job is to fly brand new, unproven vehicles to find any hidden problems or dangers, making them safe for everyone else in the future. Both Butch and Sunita had spent many years preparing for this exact moment, and they were among the most skilled and respected astronauts in the world. Butch Wilmore had been a Navy pilot who had flown combat missions and had already traveled to the International Space Station twice before, once on the Space Shuttle and once on a Russian Soyuz rocket. So he was familiar with different kinds of spacecraft. Sunita Williams was also a former Navy pilot who had spent over a year of her life living and working in space across 2 long missions, and she had even served as the commander of the entire space station. With such a strong and experienced crew, it seemed like Boeing was finally ready. But just as they were preparing for the big launch in 2023, more serious problems were discovered deep inside the spacecraft. First, engineers found a major issue with the Starliner's parachute system, which is absolutely critical for a safe return to Earth because it slows the capsule down from incredibly high speeds. Then, an even more shocking problem was found. They discovered that nearly a mile of special tape, which was used to wrap around and protect electrical wires inside the capsule, was actually flammable. This was incredibly dangerous, because a single spark could start a fire. This forced Boeing to delay the mission once again, creating a worrying feeling that the Starliner, despite its successful second flight, was still not a truly healthy or reliable machine. A company in crisis, the launch that would not happen. As the year 2024 began, the problems with the Starliner were no longer happening in private. Instead, the entire Boeing company was facing a massive public crisis. In January, a brand new Boeing 737 MAX airplane had a large piece of its body blow out in the middle of a flight. A terrifying event that put the safety of all Boeing products into question, with the company's reputation for safety being damaged so badly. The upcoming Starliner launch with Butch and Sunita became more important than ever. It was a chance for Boeing to prove to the world that it could still build safe and reliable machines. After many more months of work fixing the parachute and tape issues, a launch date was finally set for May 6, 2024. On that day, the two astronauts put on their spacesuits, waved goodbye to their families, and sat inside the Starliner capsule, ready to go, but with just 2 hours left in the countdown. Engineers heard a strange buzzing sound coming from a valve on the Atlas V rocket that carries the Starliner, and the launch had to be cancelled for safety. While the teams were working to replace the rocket valve, they decided to do more checks on the Starliner spacecraft itself, and they found yet another new problem: a small leak of helium gas. This helium gas is very important because it is used to push fuel into the small steering engines, and a leak, even a small one, could cause those engines to fail. This new discovery caused another delay, but the engineers decided the leak was very small and not a major danger. A new launch was scheduled for June 1st. Once again, the astronauts got ready. The countdown began, and everything seemed to be going perfectly. The clock ticked all the way down to less than 4 minutes before liftoff, so close to finally succeeding. But then, a ground computer, one of the machines that controls the final seconds of the launch, failed to work correctly, and for the second time. The launch was cancelled with the astronauts sitting on top of the rocket. The mission was now trapped in a repeating cycle of hope and frustrating failure. Disaster in orbit. The final moment of failure. Finally, on June 5th, 2024, after 2 frustrating failed attempts, the Boeing Starliner at last roared to life and launched successfully into the sky, carrying Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams on their long-awaited journey into orbit. For a short time, it felt like all the years of struggle and failure were finally over. But soon after, the spacecraft reached the quiet blackness of space. The problems began to return one by one, and the mission quickly turned from a moment of triumph into a situation of extreme danger. First, the small helium leak that engineers had discovered on the ground did not go away. Instead, it came back, and it was not alone. As the Starliner traveled towards the International Space Station, 4 more helium leaks suddenly appeared in different parts of the spacecraft's engine system. This was a very serious problem. But the trouble was far from over. The next day, as the Starliner was making its final approach to the space station, getting ready to carefully dock, the most critical failure of the entire mission occurred. As the spacecraft moved closer, 5 of its 28 small steering engines, which are called thrusters, suddenly stopped working. These thrusters are absolutely essential for making the small, precise movements needed to safely connect with the space station, and without them, the capsule was struggling to control its flight. The astronauts inside had to work together with the control team on the ground to manually fire the working thrusters and troubleshoot the problem. And after a tense and difficult hour, They were finally able to get the Starliner to dock. But the damage had been done. The spacecraft had proven itself to be fundamentally unreliable and unsafe at the most critical moments of its flight. NASA officials on the ground were now faced with a terrible and unavoidable question. If the Starliner was this broken on the way up, could they possibly risk the lives of 2 astronauts by trying to bring them home in the same damaged machine? The mission had failed in the most spectacular way possible. The empty spaceship returns home. After many weeks of intense discussion and analyzing all the dangerous problems that happened in space, NASA made its final and very difficult decision. The leaders of the space agency announced that the Boeing Starliner was simply not safe enough to be trusted with the lives of Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams for the return journey to Earth. This was a huge and very public admission of failure for the Boeing company. Instead of carrying its precious human cargo, the spacecraft would now have to make the dangerous trip back all by itself, controlled entirely by engineers on the ground. The mission to prove Starliner could be a reliable space taxi had officially ended in complete failure, and the main goal now was just to get the empty vehicle back in one piece so that engineers could study it and learn from all the mistakes. On September 6, 2024, the empty Starliner separated from the International Space Station for the last time and began its lonely fall back to our planet. This process is called re-entry, and it is one of the most challenging parts of any space mission because the capsule travels at unbelievable speeds, creating a massive fireball of heat around it as it streaks through the atmosphere. To survive this and slow down, the Starliner deployed its large parachutes moments before landing. Giant airbags inflated to soften the final impact with the ground. The spacecraft touched down perfectly in the quiet desert of New Mexico, and from a distance, it looked like a successful end to a mission. But even on this final journey, the Starliner's sickness showed itself again. As more of its steering thruster engines failed during the descent, the successful landing felt sad and hollow because the 2 astronauts it was built to carry were not inside. They had been left behind, waiting for a different, more reliable ship to bring them home. The space refugees and the rescue ship. While the empty Starliner was returning to Earth, its 2 human pilots, Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams, found themselves in a very strange and unexpected situation. They were now stranded in space, hundreds of miles above the planet. Their original mission was supposed to last for only about 8 days, a very short trip to test the new spacecraft, and then come right back home. But now, because their ship had failed so badly, their short visit had turned into a very long stay that would last for many months, all the way until February of the next year. They had become space refugees, travelers who had lost their ride home and were now living as long-term guests on the giant orbiting outpost, the International Space Station. Life on the space station became very crowded. The station has special sleeping compartments for only 6 astronauts, but with Butch and Sunita now living there. There were 9 people sharing the same small living space. This meant they had to find unusual places to sleep, using sleeping bags attached to the walls in different parts of the station. Their daily work also changed completely. Instead of testing the Starliner's systems, they now spent their days helping the main space station crew with their regular jobs, which included performing science experiments and doing important maintenance work to keep the station running properly. They had not packed enough clean clothes or personal items for such a long mission, but thankfully, a cargo ship eventually arrived with fresh supplies, bringing them some much-needed comfort. But the most important thing for them was the news of how they would finally get home. NASA had made an arrangement with the other space taxi company, SpaceX, to bring them back to Earth. They would have to wait for a scheduled SpaceX mission called Crew 9, and until that rescue ship arrived, they would remain in orbit, a living and constant reminder of Boeing's great failure. The final autopsy report. the death of a legacy. We can now finally understand the strange and mysterious words that Elon Musk said at the beginning of our story, when he announced that the Boeing Starliner's astronauts were not with us anymore. He was speaking a hidden truth with different layers of meaning. On the most basic and literal level, he was correct because Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams were physically not with the Boeing Starliner spacecraft anymore. They had been left behind on the space station while their broken ship flew home empty. But there was a much deeper and more important meaning to his words. A meaning that explains the entire story of this great failure. He was also saying that the idea of Boeing as a great, powerful, and reliable leader in space travel was no longer with us. For decades, the world had trusted Boeing to build the finest and safest machines to explore the heavens. But after all the years of delays, the endless technical problems, and the final dangerous failure in orbit, that trust had completely died. The sickness we saw in the Starliner was not just a collection of mistakes. It was proof that the legendary company was no longer the giant it once was. And, finally, the most important meaning of all was about the future of America in space. Before this mission, NASA had a choice between two companies for its space taxis, Boeing and SpaceX. But after Starliner failed so badly, only one company, SpaceX, was left as a proven and safe option. This means that NASA's freedom to choose and its full control over its own human spaceflight program is also no longer with us. The entire country now depends on one single private company to send its people to the stars. So, Elon Musk's statement was not just a comment. It was a declaration that an entire era of space exploration had officially ended, and a new one, led by a new king, had begun. The uncertain future and the long road back. Now that we have understood the true meaning of the Starliner's failure, we must ask the final question. What happens next for everyone involved in this story? The future is now very different from what anyone had planned 10 years ago. For the Boeing company, the path forward is incredibly difficult, even though they have the Starliner capsule back on Earth. The most important part of the ship for the investigation is missing forever. This missing part is called the service module, which is a large cylinder attached to the back of the capsule that holds all the engines, fuel, and power systems. The service module is designed to be disposable, so it breaks away from the capsule before re-entry and burns up completely in the Earth's atmosphere. This creates a giant problem for the engineers, because the 5 thruster engines that failed in space were on that service module, which means the most broken parts of the ship are now gone forever. They cannot physically look at the failed engines to see what went wrong, which makes finding and fixing the root cause of the problem a huge and very expensive challenge. For NASA, the situation is also very complicated. The space agency always wanted 2 different space taxi companies, Boeing and SpaceX, because having a backup is much safer than relying on only one. If one company's spacecraft has a problem, NASA can still send astronauts to the space station using the other company's ship. This means they will probably give Boeing another chance to fix the Starliner. But NASA will be watching every single step Boeing takes with extreme caution. And the trust that was once there is now broken. But the biggest change of all is the new balance of power in space. SpaceX and its Crew Dragon are now the clear and dominant leaders for transporting American astronauts. Boeing is no longer a proud partner in a competition, but a company that must now work very hard just to regain the trust it has lost. The Starliner spacecraft will likely fly again one day with people on board, but its story has been changed forever. It is no longer a symbol of a bright new future, but a symbol of a fallen giant's long and uncertain struggle to be trusted again.